For centuries, humans have dreamed of traveling to and walking upon another celestial body. The target of our desire, the moon. The quest began in earnest during this century, and it was May 25th, 1961, when President John F. Kennedy challenged us with an ambitious goal: to put a man on the moon before the decade was out.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
The triumphs were dizzying. The setbacks, tragic. But John Kennedy's challenge was met, and it began on a hot July morning on the space coast of Florida, July 16th, 1969.
We interrupt our regularly scheduled programming to bring you continuing coverage of the Apollo 11 moon landing mission.
We want to explain to you the reason we are back on the air now from our space headquarters.
Remember this magical week back in 1969? The whole nation was riveted to the television set as 3 Americans sped ever closer to the moon. Every time one of these special reports came on the air, we held our collective breath. Good evening, I'm Bob Opsahl, and this is Eyewitness News Space Center reporter Ross Cavett. Tonight, we're going to journey back to the glory days of space travel, 25 years ago, when human beings first set foot on the moon.
We will relive how the folks here at the Kennedy Space Center had a hand in that great adventure and see how Central Florida's Space Coast became the center of the world's attention one glorious week back in July of 1969.
That grand adventure started way back in 1961, when President Kennedy announced America's space program was aiming for the moon.
Even today, that is remembered as a bold goal, and quite frankly, many thought it was impossible.
Alan Shepard, the first American, reaches out to touch the unknown.
All right, lift off and the clock is started. All systems are go.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Here was Kennedy, a very besieged president, trying to, he had decided that space was the only way to beat the Russians, who was beating the pants off of us in space. And we had 15 minutes experience, Alan Shepard's flight, just 3 weeks before he made this statement. And I can remember looking at people and saying, this guy is nuts. He's crazy. We've got 15 minutes experience. We haven't got a rocket yet that could get us into orbit. And this guy's talking about going to the moon. Well, I think, yeah, I've talked to Alan Shepard and some of the astronauts. They thought he was crazy, too.
Maybe the goal was crazy. Maybe a lot of folks at the Cape were skeptical they could make it. A man on the moon in less than 10 years? Impossible. But Kennedy's speech inspired many to sign up with the program, including a young electrical engineering student just out of college. Al Softy eventually became a space shuttle test director.
Like every other engineer back then, I had 7 or 8 job offers when I graduated from college, and one of them was NASA. And I went to work for NASA so I could be involved in going to the moon and the excitement of it. And I went to work for NASA at a lesser salary than I could have made other places. And I came to work here specifically to be involved.
That was a philosophy that didn't exist in many places in the United States. You know, you had real good guys and you had real bad guys. In this program, they considered you to be superior or you had no business being there. And so it was a type of a program that caught your imagination and it caught your energy and your spirit.
We had a young group. In fact, our launch director, I think, was under 40 years old. And we were all, the biggest part of us were, you know, in our early 30s. And we were doing something for the first time that had never been done before, you know, putting a new vehicle together, running a new test, and every test we didn't know what was going to happen next. And so, you know, in that sense, all the guys and the gals, they were all caught up in the thing. And we'd be at work, whether we really had a job to do or not, seeing what was going to happen next. It was really a great team effort.
We had a goal. We
We had a budget which would allow us to do things, whatever we wanted, we'd get, and it was just a good time to work here.
The Kennedy Space Center geared up to meet the goal throughout the 1960s. NASA hired workers seemingly at will, eventually boosting its crew along the Space Coast to some 26,000 workers. Launch Operations Manager Paul Donnelly says it was a rare case of the government letting an agency do what needed to be done.
It was a national thing, you know. We had the country behind it, we had the president behind it, we had Congress behind it, we had everyone behind us. We didn't have to stop and apologize for little mistakes we made on the way, you know. We just kept moving.
But there was one event that NASA did have to stop for. Apollo astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee died when a fire roared through their Apollo capsule during a mock countdown. It was the low point of the decade.
The tragedy kept the Apollo program grounded for 2 years while NASA convened the largest investigative panel ever. Privately and even publicly, many had said John F. Kennedy's dream had died.
Thousands swarmed to Cape Kennedy for the launch of Apollo 7.
Have you go for orbit here, go for orbit.
But doubts about the dream faded when NASA rolled out the most powerful rocket mankind had ever seen, the Saturn V. Pointed straight at the moon, suddenly the goal seemed to be in reach.
I remember the first time that I stepped up into the inner stage of a Saturn V mock-up in Huntsville, Alabama, and I had been launching Jupiters and very early Saturns. It appeared to be as big as a building, and I could not imagine that that was just the first stage. They made a wooden mock-up, and it was like going into a 2-story, 3-story building, a big cavern, and I said, this thing cannot fly. But nevertheless, I worked toward making it fly.
I remember looking up at the Saturn V, that monster bathed in the xenon lights, and I looked and I said, you know, there's 3 guys are going to ride that thing to the moon today, and I would think back just a few years before when so many rockets around here were blowing up, and it was, you know, there were 7 or 8 launches a week, and half of them would blow up. That was in the early 1960s, late 50s, and I said, you know, man in space was just a gleam in somebody's eye then, much less going to the moon. But here we were, getting ready to go.
Well, that Saturn V, you know, to see that stack that many stages together for the first time, launch it and have it work. You know, I grew up with Atlases and Titans and Mace and Matadors and Minutemen falling all over the Cape out there, you know, in the early days. We lost a lot of vehicles. You know, you expect to see something blow up every week. And yet we stack this tremendous vehicle together and it flies. God, how do we do that? You know, that's amazing. And then we turn right around on the 3rd launch, we stick men on top of it, and we go to the moon.
Fly me to the moon, let me play among the stars.
The Apollo 11 crew represented NASA's cream of the crop. Neil Armstrong, a cruise commander, was 38 years old, a veteran naval combat pilot from the Korean War, and a test pilot. He was the command pilot for the Gemini 8 mission. Today, Armstrong is chairman of a defense electronics firm. Edwin Buzz Aldrin, 39 years old, served as lunar module pilot. He was an Air Force combat pilot and prime pilot for the Gemini 12 mission. Today, Aldrin develops ideas for space transportation systems. The command module pilot was Michael Collins. The 38-year-old was an Air Force test pilot and pilot for the Gemini 10 mission. Today, Collins is retired after authoring several books. This is the firing room at Kennedy Space Center, the same one they used to launch Apollo 11 back on July 16, 1969.
The folks who worked out here during those long years of testing and then launches say this really was their home away from home. In fact, they spent more time here than with their families.
We launched Shepard May the 5th, 1961, and President Kennedy 20 days later announced that we were going to the moon. And 5 years to that day that he announced, we moved the first Saturn V vehicle to the pad. Now, we built the facility, and we built the vehicle, and we built the spacecraft. And you can't build an automobile or an airplane in that time anymore.
Apollo was an unprecedented effort. Crews from 10 states put together the Saturn rocket, brought it to the Kennedy Space Center, and fit all the pieces together. At the same time, the giant vehicle assembly building sprung from the Earth seemingly in record time. The Apollo program was on the fast track, thanks in large part to a lot of overtime.
We had a lot of people involved, a lot of good people involved. In fact, my biggest problem in those days is to get people to quit working and go home and get some rest.
On 501, which was the first Saturn V that lifted off, our countdown demonstration test was 2 weeks long. And we'd be out here once in a while 20, 24 hours at a crack. You get a little sleep in between, but you just get right back up and get right back down in the firing room and continue working.
It was an exciting time, but a time around the Space Coast when divorce rates went up. Some people quit because of the stress. Others were forced out. But today, those who survived the grind seem to view the 60s through rose-colored glasses.
The main things I remember about it are the very upbeat nature and the can-do nature that everybody had, and the feeling that nothing was insurmountable, and the hard work. You know, people worked long hours back then, too long, you know, much too long. But it was a very exciting time.
This became your whole life. Everything else was secondary. And it was a fantastic mood. You know, it's nothing, I wouldn't have missed it for the world. It didn't do me, it didn't do my marriage any good, and a lot of my friends also suffered that way. But it was an absolutely unbelievable experience to live through.
I missed the Vietnam War completely. I didn't watch television, I didn't read the newspapers, and when I came out of Apollo and I found out there'd been a war, it's only on public TV, I think, that I really saw what happened, and I was amazed, because I was so focused on going to the moon and working those Saturns and working all the problems we had that we just didn't really look around much.
We didn't pay much attention to the outside world. We had a job in here and we had to do it, and we wanted to make sure we did it right.
Doing it right during the race to the moon would mean putting in some long hours and not necessarily getting paid for all of them. You simply did what had to be done. Home was just a place to sleep between shifts if you had time. And the bosses at KSC wanted to make sure your leisure time was limited.
I went to a management school in 1964 and 65. It was an MBA-type program. They suggested that each one of us guys at the Cape go out and visit our workers at home. And if they had a hobby, give them more work to do. that we really didn't want guys to have hobbies at home that had more impact on their lives than the program.
Even the workers' home lives were fair game at times. If they were having problems at home, they might find themselves having problems at work. The management team wanted workers with no distractions, no outside interests, no other thoughts than going to the moon. It was too much for some.
We also had some people who could not stand the mental stress. I remember that there was one employee that did some very unusual things, like he came back out to a Saturn V one night and did some unauthorized things. And the next morning, the Germans called me, and security had found this guy out there doing something. And the Germans called me in and said, we're going to sign this guy to you, and you're going to be responsible for him until we can see what's wrong. In the early days, to make a mistake means they took your badge, escorted you to the gate, and says you're out. And those people who made mistakes didn't stay here. So, you know, we came up under a culture where you were expected to do it right. I remember one time I put a guy in for a superior award, and my German boss was Dr. Hans Gruner. He came to me and he says, Jim, we can't give this guy an award. And I said, why? He says, because we expect everyone to be superior. If we single this guy out as being a superior guy, what did he do that the rest of the guys didn't do?
Bob, everybody talked about how much time they spent working out here and working on Apollo, but I couldn't find anyone who seemed to regret a minute of it.
Oh, I believe it. I guess that's what happens when you know you're making history.
Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start.
Mr. Spaceman, won't you please take me along for a ride?
Just watching that grainy black and white picture and watching the lander come down and touch down, and then later watching Neil and Buzz come out, it really struck me with awe and inspired me to dream about becoming an astronaut.
I remember also going outside and looking up at the moon that night and thinking to myself, there's people up there.
Apollo 11's mission to the moon was not the only thing on our minds that week in July 1969. Believe it or not, NASA's incredible adventure was fighting for headline space. We may never see another time like it again. July 1969, a snapshot in time that spoke volumes about our culture. The week of Apollo 11, the country was talking about President Richard Nixon's move to pull 25,000 troops out of Vietnam. But even that announcement didn't stop the anti-war protests. Also that week, in July 1969, a small bridge in Chappaquiddick made big headlines. After a party, Senator Ted Kennedy drove his car off that bridge. He was able to get out and swim ashore. His passenger, Mary Jo Kopechne, was not. She drowned, plunging Ted Kennedy into a public relations nightmare and sending the press into a feeding frenzy.
Pick up a phone.
On a lighter note, Americans had a favorite television show to look forward to that week.
Melons.
Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In was the #1 program in America and one of TV's all-time classics. And that week in July of '69, the once laughable New York Mets were making an amazing run toward a world championship.
Amazing! Amazing!
Amazing!
If we could put a man on the moon...
Bob, I'm so glad you put that in about the '69 Mets. That's still a very sore spot for those of us Chicago Cubs fans.
So I've heard.
What do you remember about 1969?
Oh, it sticks in my mind very well. That was the summer I joined the Navy and started seeing the world. Well, even with all the events going on in the world at the time, life here revolved around the moonshot.
Not just within the walls of the Kennedy Space Center, but all around the Space Coast, they could think of only one thing: putting a man on the moon. In 1969, about the only place you could have 1 million people gather without a riot was the road surrounding Cape Kennedy. The moonshot was a welcome sight on the front pages of the day.
The country was in pretty bad shape. We'd sort of come apart in a lot of ways. Many things were bad. This was good. We could look in the future and say, God, there is hope.
One of those faces in the crowd was Cape Canaveral's own Marie Felgar.
Well, back then, the only thing on the news was about the war. And that's all you really saw was a lot of bombs going off and a lot of men dying. And this was history being made and something nice and not something, not a war.
Marie took some home movies of the launch while her husband, Charles, watched from a front row seat, the top of a fuel tank at neighboring Port Canaveral.
It was a hot, sticky day. And I remember we went up to the top of the tank to watch it. And I remember when the launch went off, the tank we were standing on, it shook and everything else. Everybody was wondering what was going to happen because, you know, the old tank was shaking and kind of scary in a little way.
Charles still has one of the most popular items of the day, an official certificate signed by his friends proving he witnessed the moonshot.
Everybody was seen to getting them, and you had all your friends sign them where you witness you watched the launch. And it was a nice keepsake, so everybody around the neighborhood was doing it.
There's the crowds assembled, and that's the jetty at Port Canaveral, some 10 miles or 11 miles south of Pad 39 and our ABC News Space Headquarters here at the Cape.
So many people had crowded the area around Cape Kennedy that getting to the launch site became a major league hassle. Network anchor Walter Cronkite almost didn't make it to the press site.
Even with the passes down to our hips and so many on the front of the car that you couldn't see out of the windshield, it took us 2.5 hours to get here from Cocoa Beach, and that was just people inside who had passes. In Merritt Island, the traffic was unbelievable.
All the grocery stores began to run out of bread and milk, and all the public restrooms were closed, or they were being clogged. And I remember on the morning I went into work about 20 hours before launch of Apollo 11. I came down US 1 here in town. There were people lying in the medians in sleeping bags all the way from where the NASA Causeway is today all the way around to the North Gate. And of course this wasn't even the most popular place. The jetty park and the causeway was full. And these people had been here for a couple of days.
The night that we came to work for Apollo 11, they had provisions for us that they were afraid of big traffic jams, you know, and they had a helicopter standing by to come pick us up if required. I got to work okay. I came in early, and I don't really know of anybody who had to use the helicopter, but I know that they were there in case we needed them.
At the Complex 39 press site, 3,000 journalists crammed the stands. AP reporter Howard Benedict was the Cape's veteran journalist, and he watched as some of the reporting got a bit out of control.
They were reporting crazy things about the moon, and they didn't really know, you know, there were a lot of them were really giving the scare tactics. You know, these guys are going to be risking their lives, are going to go out there and die. They did not know how much careful preparation had gone into this thing. And there were many of them who were out there with just doom and gloom. These guys are really not going to make it. But anything about that flight made news, because I remember there was a storm in Houston the night before, and a hackberry tree in Mike Collins' yard blew down. Well, that made the AP wire, it made the network news, just the fact that a storm blew down a tree in his backyard. That's the type of thing that was.
Hartwell Conklin was one of those trying to nab such a scoop. He produced for Walter Cronkite and watched the reaction in the press stands as the Saturn lifted off.
And we really thought that people were going to pass out and scream and faint and things off the rocket, birds off the pad. And I'm doing my work. I'm looking up in the press stand. And of course, it was a great deal of emotion, you know, there, and tears streaming down.
Astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and then finally Mike Collins, plus their suit.
Remember this famous shot of Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin heading to the pad? KSC worker John Angel was one of those guys in the background, and he shot this film with his handheld camera.
Yeah, everybody wanted a picture, and like I said, and then those pictures made the headlines all over the world. The big thing about that launch was that was the only time I've ever seen where the entire world was totally engrossed in the mission.
Brevard schoolteacher and part-time KSC tour guide Oscar Hollister drew VIP duty for Apollo 11. He and several other guides chaperoned dozens of members of Congress arriving for the launch.
We joked about it later. We had Congress under our control for a whole day and didn't get one bill passed. I think they were somewhat apprehensive. You know, will it go? You know, is our money well spent? And of course, being politicians, naturally, that's what they go for.
Along with the politicians like former President Lyndon Johnson and his wife Lady Bird and Vice President Spiro Agnew, Hollister's 8mm camera captured the celebrities on hand like Ed McMahon and Johnny Carson, Jack Benny, and others. And he stood with them all as they watched the countdown clock reach 0.
Most people were subdued up to that point. And even when the firepower began and all that thrust from the engines, when it began, not at first, but as soon as the sound came across, People cried. I guess some prayed. They did all sorts of things. Many cheered.
All right, Bob, everybody remembers this. Where were you when man finally landed on the moon?
Whew, well, it was a long time ago, but at the time I was going to college down in Coral Gables and watched the whole thing on a black and white TV in my family room. How about you? Where were you?
Well, I was a little kid growing up in Normal, Illinois. The thing I remember about it, it was the first night my parents let me stay up late.
Oh, that must have been nice.
And I was driving back from Georgia from a wedding of one of my cousins. And I remember very distinctly because we were not only listening on the radio to all the reports coming back, but we were leaning toward the radio.
You know, it's probably one of my earliest memories. I just remember basically everything coming to a standstill and everybody at my house, or it might even have been my grandparents' house, just glued to the TV set watching the whole thing.
I can remember being so nervous that I couldn't watch it. I was pacing around, I had my eyes closed, you know, I was running in and out of the room.
Okay, engine stop. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
This is Launch Pad 39A, where the Space Shuttle Columbia lifted off less than 2 weeks ago. It's the same pad where an Apollo spacecraft, also named Columbia, lifted off 25 years ago.
Much of the same structure that was there then is still there today. And imagine how it was 25 years ago when Kennedy Space Center workers were about to see a decade's worth of work pay off.
The night before we launched at 7 o'clock in the morning. The night before, about 11 o'clock, everybody, we were clearing the pad, getting ready for the cryogenic tanking. And just as we exited the pad, I took a turn around and looked at the vehicle all bathed in white and black with the searchlights on it. And I had a fantastic feeling of awe, knowing that the next morning that 3 astronauts would crawl into that small capsule on top, and 2 which would land on the moon about another 4 or 5 days later.
The prime crew now departing from their crew quarters here at the Kennedy Space Center.
All going well at T-minus 17 minutes and 37 seconds.
Command Module pilot Michael Collins now proceeding across the swing arm.
As NASA prepared to write history, to go to the moon, land there, and come back, crews at the Kennedy Space Center wondered, did they do everything possible to get ready? Was the Saturn V safe? And some even wondered if this would be the mission to land on the moon.
I remember on Apollo 11, we felt like that it wasn't so important that we landed as that we got close by, that if they had to abort and go back and rejoin up and come back, we had another vehicle ready to go right after that, Apollo 12, where we could have done it on the next flight. We knew that if we got that close and everything worked well, that chances are we'd be able to make it in the decade that we had said we would do it in.
We're just in the process of closing the hatch on the Apollo 11 spacecraft.
Our paper system was very poor. If we wanted to, if one of the engineers wanted to change something in the launch countdown, they'd simply come to my console and we wrote it in there, you know. Today, that change would take a number of people to look and scrutinize and sign. And so it was very loose, but again, it worked quite well, surprisingly.
It has to be over 100 degrees here in the broiling Florida sun, where the VIPs, the very important persons, and indeed the VVIPs, the very, very important persons, are gathered to watch this launch just downrange. Among them here are former President Johnson, who helped to shape the space program as Senate Majority Leader. There are a host of diplomats, more than 100 ambassadors and foreign science advisors, and many, many congressmen here, too. And they're all getting ready for this day they'll all remember, the day men went to the moon, a moment in history.
The problems that worried me was the fact that we didn't want any human error. We had had cases where problems existed on the vehicle prior to liftoff that we didn't catch until we got in the air. Those kind of things worried me the most of all, about where a person has done the best they can do, but you've got a gotcha there. I remember one time on one of the earlier programs that we had an air conditioning system that was actually leaking, and it was cooling the instrument unit. And we didn't find out about it until it got about halfway to the moon that all of a sudden the instrument unit temperature went up. And we almost didn't make it to the moon on this shot because the temperature rose to the point we almost had to abort the flight. We checked that out, and we found out that leak had existed since working in the VAB.
All indications coming in to the control center at this time indicate we are go. 1 minute, 25 seconds and counting.
But Apollo 11 would have no such problems. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins boarded the Saturn V on time, and the countdown ticked down smoothly, almost too smooth for some.
I was sitting out in the press stands there with an open phone to our bureau in Houston. We had set up a space bureau in Houston. I was telling you know, how things are really getting quiet around here. And then in the final few minutes, and then there would be the buzzing, and everybody was getting excited. And then all of a sudden, in the last minute, everything was just very silent. As people listened to Jack King give the countdown, and they watched the countdown clock out there. It was kind of eerie. It was very kind of eerie.
30 seconds and counting. Astronauts report it feels good.
The 3 launches preceding Apollo 11, of course, were launches in Earth orbit and lunar orbit in preparation for Apollo 11. And when we got to Apollo 11, the countdown really went smooth. It was like we'd been practicing for years.
10, 9, ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
The 6.5 million pound, 40-story tall rocket roared to life, the Saturn V belching out more than 7.5 million pounds of thrust. It carried the dreams of a nation with it, the hard work of thousands, and carried 3 astronauts toward their historic rendezvous with the moon.
This is Houston. You are go for staging.
As soon as the Saturn cleared the Complex 39 launch tower, Kennedy Space Center's work was done. And folks here almost immediately turned their attention toward the Apollo 12 spacecraft, ready to roll out of the VAB. But to say the least, they spent a lot of time looking at the sky.
That crew, as every crew, you know, flies with all of us flying with them. I don't know anyone here now or back then that didn't have a real sense that they were flying with the crews and with the ship. You know, we all had that sense of ownership.
At 4 forward, drift into the right a little.
30 seconds. 30 seconds.
Forward, just contact right. Okay, engine stop. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
I remember being very emotional, you know, when watching Neil step down. You know, just, you know, we had accomplished half the goal, and that was getting them there. And of course, a few days later, we were going to bring them back, and that would be the other half of the goal that John Kennedy gave us. But I remember a real sense of satisfaction and being quite emotional.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Nobody even thought past that moon landing. What do we do next?
After the smoke had cleared, after the mission, after the parades, there was a post-landing depression of sorts along the Space Coast, a depression that would hit the area hard and affect thousands of families.
The biggest shock I had was we got to the moon. You know, Apollo 11 worked. It wasn't 2 weeks after we got back from the moon that we were told to lay off a horrendous number of people. We'd made the goal. You know, we'd made Kennedy's goal. Okay, guys, now it's time to start cutting the dollars back. And I had about a 38-man group at that time, and I had to lay off 18 people. These people that were laid off, of course, you know, they went from a high of, golly, we did it, to an absolute low, like, my God, what am I going to do now?
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
You do have to be
I suspect we'll be talking about how the old days are better than the way we're doing it right now.
Hearing you. Hey, you look good, man. You look real good. When I grow up, I want to be just like you.
A lot of these people here that are here tonight worked with me back in '58 on the Atlas, and then we moved on over to the Apollo, and they're all looking good, and we're all having a good time, and I'm sure glad to see them all.
Can you believe it's been 25 years since 11?
No. It's just impossible to believe it's been that long. But it's been great. And we need to try to do it again, another 10 or so.
You look at a person and say, gee whiz, I don't know this guy. And you look at the eyes, and pretty soon you see a guy blossom that you knew 20 years ago. And it's just fantastic to come back and relive some of the earlier years.
Some have been kinder than other. He said I only had to lose 12 pounds. Really, it's about 20 pounds.
What do these guys look like compared to how they looked 25 years ago?
Surprisingly, they look pretty good. They look pretty good. Some are missing, though. Well, most of them look like me, a little grayer and a little fatter, but other than that, they look pretty good.
Now we're on Pad 34, site of some of the first Apollo missions and the site of the Apollo 1 fire that killed 3 astronauts. Now they call it Stonehenge, and you can see why.
Some say this is the epitome of what happened to the space program after the glory days of Apollo. NASA, they say, never quite had the same energy. Things will never be the same. It's an old cliche, but one that certainly gets a workout when folks talk about the space program.
We had young management. We had a new agency. There was no bureaucracy in it. I remember 20 years later talking to, I believe, Al Shepard and Frank Borman. And of course, I knew Shepard. We were together in the Navy. And Al said, Paul, I said, we came a long way, NASA, didn't we? I mean, in that 20 years. I said, you know, Al, I said, NASA is so great. It took the Navy 200 years to become as bureaucratic as it is. NASA caught up in 20 years.
Back then, NASA was too young an organization to be caught up in the bureaucracy of Washington or the politics of Washington, but it didn't take long. But now it is one big bureaucratic organization, and it takes so long to get decisions made. You got layer after layer of people who've got to make decisions. Back then, there was a group of people there. They said, let's do it. Let's get the job done. And they did it.
The Apollo 11 launch tower 25 years later. This is the White Room where the 3 astronauts entered their capsule. And this is the rest of Apollo 11's mobile launcher platform. 410 feet tall at one time. It's now been cut in pieces and is being stored in a large field here at the Kennedy Space Center. You know, for many of the folks who worked here back in 1969, this scene sort of symbolizes the drive, determination, and desire of America's space program ever since man set foot on the moon.
At that time, I really never felt that way. I figured that, you know, the space program would move on into bigger and better things, and we really haven't done as many things as I probably had predicted at that time that we would.
We don't have quite the goal we had back then. We wanted to get to the moon, and now we just, with our budget problems in Congress working on us back and forth, there just doesn't seem to be quite the goal there was then.
When Apollo 11 left the launch pad, NASA was the darling of the administration, the most popular part of the government with the public. The space agency made folks feel good about being an American. NASA's $5 billion budget was more than 5% of the entire U.S. budget, and nobody seemed to mind. Today, NASA takes up less than 1% of the budget and has to fight for every penny. And Congress seems more eager to spend money on science projects rather than sending men and women into space.
There's too much paper, Bureaucracy is set in, and I think a lot of it's due to the budget and Congress not letting us really do what we want to do.
Booster ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Columbia on a multi-nation research flight.
NASA's recent track record hasn't helped its reputation. High-profile problems like the troubles with the Hubble Space Telescope, the loss of the Mars Observer, and a shuttle program that's gone way over budget. Some say those problems were caused because the space agency has no direction.
We went to the moon in a period of generating the space program in a period of about 10 years. What have we done since? We as a nation. Now, we have a space shuttle, it's an orbiter, but most of it was off the shelf on things that were generated during the Apollo program. We have been very negligent in this country in keeping our leadership role in space.
NASA's next frontier appears to be the space station, designed to be a huge U.S. outpost in space. Budget problems have forced administrators to drastically scale it back and bring in Russia as a partner. The station doesn't seem to inspire the country, the Congress, or even those close to the space program.
And I think today we just got through with a vote on space station in the Congress. Even though we had a very good vote, you look at it and where is that common goal today on space? You don't see NASA really having the vision or putting out the vision, I think, of what our common goal should be, even for the next 10 years, much less for longer.
The young people today, I would say, are probably smarter. They have a better background, but in those days, we probably weren't as smart, but we wanted to learn real bad.
Back then, you know, there was the dedication and the total commitment to the program doesn't exist today. Today, it's a job. You know, and I don't say we don't have a lot of dedicated, hard-working people over there, but it's a regular job. And, you know, come 4 o'clock, I'm off. Back in those days, it was, you know, it's not when the end of the day is, it's when you finish the job, when I've got the paper closed, when I'm happy that I've left a clean package behind me to move on to something else, then I'll leave.
I think some people's memory is a little bit flawed when they think about that. This launch team is the best it ever was, and is better than the Apollo 11 or the Apollo 17 or the Apollo Soyuz launch team. You know, today we have the best of the best, and they are better than what we had back then. And I've heard people comment to the contrary, and that's just grossly inaccurate.
It's easy as you get older, too, to look back and always think it looked better behind you than it does today or what's coming up. But I really believe that, you know, the job satisfaction back in those days is not going to be repeated. It's just not, you know, the goals, the country behind you, the unlimited money, you know, that's always a big help. But everything that happened on Apollo, we always had the money and the manpower to throw into it and fix it. And of course, we don't have that today.
What we do have today are the memories of an event 25 years ago that inspired millions, captivated the world, and sent science forward by leaps and bounds. Those who were involved say the cost in dollars, hard work, and lives was well worth it.
Lives were changed back here in a tremendous way, all across the world. They'll never be the same. Now, you can't put a value on that, really. It's not what it costs to build the rockets. I mean, the value of that is much more than the expense involved.
I think in this century, it's going to be the most outstanding event that really occurred in the world in this century. It compares to Columbus discovering America.
For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one. One in their pride in what you have done, and one in our prayers that you will return safely to Earth.
Those were the days, Bob, but most of the folks here at the Kennedy Space Center don't talk about going back to the moon anymore. They say that after the space station, NASA's next target should be the planet Mars.
Yeah, but those of us who were around back then, 25 years ago, wouldn't mind seeing another moon mission to recapture some of the excitement of those glory days.
We feel that this stands as a symbol of the insatiable curiosity of all mankind to explore the unknown.
From the Sea of Tranquility to the Pacific Ocean, Apollo 11's Odyssey was completed on July 24, 1969. Back home aboard the USS Hornet, the crew, dressed like aliens from the world they had just visited, was shuttled into a quarantine van where they would spend the next 3 weeks. Talk about coming back down to Earth. One day you're bouncing around on the moon. The next you're playing gin rummy in a trailer, waiting for a doctor's okay to be let out. But even inside quarantine, kept from the adoring outside world, the astronauts were the center of attention. We silently wondered, would America ever have heroes like this again? 5 missions to the moon after Apollo 11. In science and scope, they dwarfed the original mission. The crews stayed on the moon longer, finding more interesting places to explore.
The technology improved. The pictures coming from the lunar surface were sharper, some even in color, but Americans seemed to quit watching.
It was that first mission to the moon, Apollo 11, that captured our imagination. We watched in awe, transfixed to those fuzzy, otherworldly images coming to us from the Sea of Tranquility. It was then we knew we could do anything. If we had never gone to the moon again, it probably wouldn't have mattered to the average American. Because for one magical week in July 1969, we soared beyond the bounds of Earth and made our mark on another world.
The prime crew now departing from their crew quarters here at the Kennedy Space Center. T-minus 15 seconds. Astronauts report it feels good. Guidance is internal. 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6.
You're now 177,000 miles out, over.
Okay, engine stop. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind. For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives. All the people on this earth are truly one.
If you'd like a VHS cassette of WFTV's Apollo 11, A View from the Cape, you can purchase one at City Stuff, located in Orlando City Hall.